Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Kraft, and my capstone project is Concussions in Japanese Football for PE 584. This is my chapter 1 through 3 PowerPoint presentation. An introduction to my project here is that concussions in football have kind of been a hot topic recently in America, and a lot of athletes, ever since we've learned about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is widely referred to as CTE, it's really been at the forefront of a lot of our conversation with football in America. And a lot of the player safety and procedures in America have come a long way in the last 10 years. But in Japan, these rules aren't in place. There is not an NCAA or a governing board to curtail practice times, contact periods, or protocol for injury. So it's a lot of self-reporting. I've been here for 6 years, and it's something that I see, and I see the way they tackle with the head down a lot, and the style of play out here, and it's significant. So with that, the purpose and central research questions of my project are, the purpose of this study is to explore Japanese football players' perceptions of concussions. Central research questions of this study examined are as follows. What are Japanese football players' knowledge about concussions? What are Japanese football players' perceptions about concussions? And what effect does Japanese game and practice schedule have on concussions among Japanese football players? And then we were providing 3 of our articles or 3 critical pieces of information that support our study. And the first one that I have to share is the dangers of cumulative head blows. And this was a really interesting study that took course over a two-year course, where the researchers took football players from junior high and high school levels, and they attached sensors in their helmets to test the impact that they're having. And then they also tested these players before and after the seasons and took MRIs of their brains to see what kind of was going on. And the details of that are in the PowerPoint, but it was a really interesting that what they were doing with their testing and how they could locate which part of the brain was being affected by where their heads were hit and how they were hit in the face mask or the top of the head or side of the head, and how those impacts affected different parts of the brain and what parts of the brain were most vulnerable. And so a lot of frontal temporal damage and cerebral damage were the biggest impacts, where we receive a lot of front impacts. And something that was really significant about this research was that players who received or showed signs of concussions sustained an average of 546 blows to the head, and those without concussions sustained an average of 656 blows. But the thing that was the most shocking is that those who showed no signs of concussion but impairment, meaning they had testing either with the MRIs or the testing that they did cognitively that you can notice, they received over 1,000 blows to the head. So that was really significant. The second research article here is the frequency of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this article or journal was really popular in America before this football season. It was all over the news, and what they did is they got 222 deceased former football players, and these were all people who felt that they might have CTE, or felt that, or their family members felt that they might have CTE, and they all donated their brains, which is becoming more and more common to this research. And part of it was done through Harvard and Boston College, I believe, if I remember correctly. And it's all, they've categorized these people, their brains, and what they would do is they would call their families or their doctors or their therapists, and they would categorize them. How can I explain? Any deficiencies that they had, like their moods, or if they had depression, or their kind of broke them down into characteristics, and they used a psychologist for that interview process of the doctors and the family members. And then what the scientists did is they took the brain and they cut it into a bunch of pieces and a bunch of slices, and they were looking for those signs of what they might have been diagnosed with. So if it was depression or dementia or Alzheimer's, they have certain ways of looking at your brain and going, these are signs of that. With CTE, there are what they call pretangles, and it's basically like, you could think of it as a scar tissue building up in your brain. And so they were able to cut these brains up into a lot of pieces and determine if the athletes had CTE, which is the only way to determine if you have CTE is post death, and looking at the brain. And so what they discovered was that, and there's all the information is in the slide, but as you progress through your play, so high school, there was, a significant number. Then college, there's even more, and then the Canadian League, there's more, and semi-pro, there's more. And then once you get to the NFL, it's 110 out of 111 former football players that had CTE. And so then they categorized the brains of like mild and severe CTE, and how their behavioral symptoms and cognitive symptoms might have showed how bad their CTE might have been. But this has its limitations, because these were all people who thought they might have CTE. They're not cutting up everybody who's ever played brains, and that is a huge limitation, because it's all people who have problems, and so they're all looking at people who are most likely going to have these problems. But it is important. And then finally, the need for no contact periods is the last article, which I'm citing here. And it's important because of Japan, because this was a really interesting study where these researchers took a bunch of Division III college football players, and they did MRI testing, and they were looking at their white brain matter, the white matter in their brains, which is what makes a lot of the connections in your logic and stuff. And they tested these 10 football players. They had 5 non-athletes that they were testing their brains. And what they showed was that in all these football players, before the season, had a normal white brain matter. And then right after the season, when they tested them again, they had significantly less white brain matter by a lot. And then they tested them again 6 months later, and that their brains hadn't recovered from that fully yet. And so it's showing that like you need more than 6 months for your brain to fully recover back to its normal health. And none of these guys had concussions. It's all just from subconcussive blows, which goes back to the first slide. And it points out that we really need this no contact period, and that just because you have you don't have a concussion doesn't mean that there's not damage. That is the perfect storm for developing CTE. Is you have no signs of concussion, because they were testing these guys and their brain function, but also their brains had trauma. And so that's exactly what's happening when you are getting CTE. You might not necessarily have a concussion, but your brain has the trauma and you keep pounding away at it. So this is significant, and they need time where they're not competing. They can't just keep doing the year-round contact periods. And so with that, I think it's really interesting to find out what they think. So what Japanese players feel, what do they know? Do they even understand the concussions? And so the procedures and the methodology, using a qualitative design, because the language barrier, I can't really do interviews with these guys, so it's really important to get the pen and paper feedback. A lot of the players might respond, and the language barrier is important. Also, the culture of Japan, where they might not necessarily give you their true feelings. So I think choosing a qualitative design where I have Likert questions and I have yes and no questions where they have to choose a side of what they think is going to give me more feedback than if I had just asked them in a qualitative way and they might just kind of go, choto, like a little bit, I don't know, which means, yeah, it's a problem, but they don't want to say it. So they can clearly just write it down. It might get a better response. The participants have to be college-aged, 18 to 25-year-old Japanese enrolled in the university students who are members of the football team. And my survey instrument is the Japanese College Football Concussion Survey, JCFCS, and it's a 4-part questionnaire with demographics. The first part is the data collection, the demographics. The second portion is 8 true and false. The third question is a Likert scale questions, and the fourth is yes, no. So that's my project going forward, and I look forward to seeing what all you have to present also.